Have you ever wondered what it feels like to stand on the edge of death, completely unaware that something as simple as a dog's collar could be the only thing separating you from a massacre? What if I told you that in the suffocating heat of a Pacific jungle 79 years ago, one Doberman carrying a blood-soaked piece of fabric prevented what military historians now call the deadliest ambush that never happened? Before we dive into this story, I need your help. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This channel depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these hidden war stories to light. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has been buried in classified files for decades, and we need your support to continue exposing these secret chapters of history. The island of Guadalcanal in August 1943 was not a place where men went to live. It was a place where they went to discover exactly how they would die. The jungle itself seemed designed by some malevolent architect, its canopy so thick that noon looked like twilight, its air so heavy with moisture that every breath felt like drowning. Marines who survived the campaign would later say that the jungle was a third combatant in the war, as deadly as any Japanese soldier, perhaps more so. Captain Robert Edmund Hawthorne of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion had been on Guadalcanal for 47 days when he first encountered the dog that would save his entire company. Hawthorne was 32 years old, a former university professor from Charleston, South Carolina, who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. His hands, which once held chalk and literature books, now gripped an M1911 pistol with the kind of familiarity that terrified him during his few moments of reflection. The Marine War Dog program had been established only months earlier, a desperate innovation born from the impossible terrain of the Pacific Theater. Traditional reconnaissance methods failed in jungles where visibility extended maybe 20 feet on a good day, where the enemy could be 3 yards away and completely invisible. Dogs, specifically Doberman pinschers, proved capable of detecting enemy soldiers at distances up to 300 yards, even in complete darkness, even in rain that fell like punishment from an angry god. Hawthorne's unit had been assigned a Doberman named Kurt 3 weeks prior. The dog had arrived with Corporal James Michael Sullivan, a 24-year-old handler from rural Montana who spoke to Kurt in a low, constant murmur that seemed to calm not just the dog, but the men around them. Sullivan had trained with Kurt at the War Dog Training Center in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where the two had formed a bond that transcended the typical relationship between soldier and animal. Sullivan would later write in a letter that never reached his family, "Kurt does not see me as his master. He sees me as the weaker member of our pack, the one who needs protecting." On the morning of August 19, 1943, Hawthorne received orders that made his stomach turn. His company was to advance 3 miles northwest through uncharted jungle to secure a ridge designated Point Tango on military maps. Intelligence suggested the area was lightly defended. Intelligence, Hawthorne had learned, was often catastrophically wrong. They moved out at 0500 hours, 43 men moving in single file through vegetation so dense they had to hack through it with machetes. Kurt walked point with Sullivan, the dog's ears constantly rotating, his body taut with concentration. Hawthorne watched them and felt something he rarely allowed himself in combat: hope. The jungle consumed sound in strange ways. A man could fire a rifle 30 feet away, and it would sound muffled, distant. But a branch snapping underfoot would crack like thunder. The Marines moved in near silence, communicating with hand signals, each man hyper-aware that every step might be their last. After 3 hours, they had covered maybe 1.5 miles. The jungle seemed to resist their passage, as if the island itself opposed their presence. Private First Class Daniel Reeves, from Houston, Texas, whispered to the man behind him that the jungle felt alive, watching. He was not wrong. Kurt stopped suddenly at 0847 hours. Sullivan raised his fist, the signal for complete halt. Every Marine froze, their training overriding their instinct to drop or seek cover. Movement in the jungle attracted attention. Stillness was survival. The dog's posture had changed completely. His ears were forward, his tail rigid, every muscle in his lean body locked in alert. Sullivan touched Kurt's head gently, feeling the low vibration of a growl that never reached the dog's throat. Something was ahead. Something dangerous. Hawthorne moved forward carefully, positioning himself next to Sullivan. The handler's face was pale despite his tan. "Captain," Sullivan whispered, his voice barely audible even 6 inches away. "Kurt's giving me the enemy alert. Multiple targets. Close range." This was the nightmare scenario. In the jungle, close range meant the enemy could see you just as easily as you could see them. Except the Japanese were better at this. They had been fighting in Asian jungles for years. They knew how to become invisible. Hawthorne had to make a decision: push forward and potentially walk into an ambush, or fall back and report that his unit had failed to secure their objective. Neither option appealed to him, but only one kept his men alive. He was about to give the order to withdraw when Kurt did something unprecedented. The Doberman suddenly broke from Sullivan's control and bolted forward into the jungle. Sullivan's face went white with panic. A war dog breaking discipline was not just unusual, it was virtually unheard of. These animals were trained with a rigor that would break most men. For Kurt to abandon his handler meant something had triggered an instinct stronger than his training. "Kurt," Sullivan hissed, but the dog was gone, swallowed by the green darkness ahead. For 15 seconds, the Marines stood in perfect silence, every man expecting the burst of gunfire that would announce Kurt had run straight into enemy lines. 15 seconds felt like 15 hours. Then they heard it. Not gunfire, but something worse, a sound that would haunt several Marines for the rest of their lives. It was a human scream, high-pitched and agonized, cut short with terrible abruptness. Then another scream. Then chaos erupted in the jungle ahead, the sound of men shouting in Japanese, the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles firing in panic. Hawthorne made his decision in a heartbeat. Forward! Double time! The Marines surged ahead, their training taking over, weapons ready. What they discovered in the clearing 60 yards ahead would be documented in field reports, discussed in classified briefings, and ultimately buried in files that would not be declassified for 50 years. The clearing was small, maybe 40 feet in diameter, and it had been transformed into a killing ground. The Japanese had prepared it with meticulous care. Camouflaged foxholes positioned in a semicircle, fields of fire overlapping to create a crossfire pattern that would have annihilated Hawthorne's company in seconds. Spider holes concealed beneath foliage where snipers could wait for hours, days, if necessary. The clearing was designed to look like a natural passage through the jungle, the obvious route for any advancing force. It was perfect. It was lethal. And it was in complete disarray. 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying at various points in the clearing. Kurt was nowhere to be seen, but the Doberman's work was evident. One soldier's throat had been torn open. Another had his arm mangled, the bone visible through shredded flesh. The third was screaming, clutching his face, where Kurt had apparently attacked with precision that spoke to his training. But what froze Hawthorne in place was not the carnage. It was what else he saw in that clearing. Positioned along the tree line, partially concealed but now visible to trained eyes, were 17 additional Japanese soldiers, all in fighting positions, all with weapons trained on the exact spot where Hawthorne's company would have emerged if they had continued on their original path. Staff Sergeant William Harrison from Atlanta, Georgia, who had fought in Tulagi and Tarawa before Guadalcanal, would later state in his debriefing, "It was a perfect L-shaped ambush. We would have walked right into the kill zone. First man through would have triggered it. We would have lost 2/3 of the company in the first 5 seconds. The rest of us would have died trying to retreat through jungle we'd just cut through. There would have been no survivors." The Japanese soldiers were shouting at each other, their carefully prepared ambush compromised by the unexpected appearance of the dog. Some were repositioning, trying to adapt to the new threat. Others were scanning the jungle, expecting the Marine attack to come from the direction Kurt had appeared. Their discipline was impressive, but their element of surprise was gone. Hawthorne did not hesitate. "Flank left and right. Mortars on the far side. Move!" The engagement that followed lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting where men fired at shadows and muzzle flashes. The Marines' advantage was the chaos Kurt had created and their knowledge of the Japanese positions. The disadvantage was that they were still outnumbered. When the firing stopped, 11 Japanese soldiers were dead. 6 had retreated deeper into the jungle. The Marines had suffered 3 wounded, none critically. By any measure, it was an overwhelming tactical victory, the kind that military analysts study in war colleges. But victory was not what occupied Hawthorne's thoughts as his men secured the perimeter. He was looking for Kurt, the dog who had saved them all by doing something that defied explanation. Sullivan was already moving through the clearing, calling the Doberman's name in a voice tight with fear and hope. They found Kurt at the far edge of the clearing, near one of the concealed foxholes. The dog was alive but injured, a bullet grazed along his ribs that bled, but did not seem life-threatening. Sullivan dropped to his knees beside the Doberman, his hands shaking as he examined the wound. Kurt's tail wagged weakly, and he licked Sullivan's face, which made several hardened Marines look away, their eyes suddenly wet. But it was Corporal Anthony DeMarco from Brooklyn, New York, who noticed what everyone else had missed in the immediate aftermath of combat. "Captain," DeMarco said, his voice strange. "Captain, you need to see this." DeMarco was standing next to Kurt, pointing at the Doberman's collar. Standard military issue, leather, with a metal tag identifying the dog's unit and handler. But attached to the collar, secured with what looked like strips of cloth tied hastily, was something that did not belong there. A map. Not a military map, but something hand-drawn on what appeared to be rice paper, the kind Japanese soldiers carried. The map was soaked with blood, some of it human, some of it likely Kurt's, but still legible. And drawn on that map, in precise detail, was not just the ambush position they had just fought through. It showed 7 more ambush positions, 7 more carefully prepared killing grounds, positioned along every possible approach to Point Tango, each one marked with Japanese characters that none of the Marines could read, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. This was not a small operation. This was a coordinated effort to destroy any Marine force attempting to reach the ridge. Hawthorne's hands trembled as he held the map. The implications were staggering. If his company had somehow survived this first ambush, they would have walked into another one, and another. Point Tango was not a strategic position to be secured. It was bait. The entire mission had been compromised before it began. "How did Kurt get this?" Sullivan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question everyone was thinking, but afraid to ask. Hawthorne looked at the blood on the map, then at the dog. Kurt was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than a dog should. The blood on the collar was fresh, less than an hour old based on its consistency. The map had been attached recently, possibly right before Kurt had broken away from the company. "Search the area," Hawthorne ordered. "Every inch of this clearing and 50 yards beyond. I want to know where this map came from." What they found over the next hour would transform a tactical victory into something far more disturbing, something that raised questions that would never be fully answered. In one of the concealed foxholes, the Marines discovered the body of a Japanese soldier who had died very differently from the others. His wounds were not from bullets or the dog's attack. His throat had been cut with precision, the kind of cut that killed instantly and silently. Next to his body was a second map, identical to the one on Kurt's collar, and a collection of documents that would take military intelligence weeks to fully translate. But more disturbing was what Private Leonard Tucker from New Orleans, Louisiana, found in the soldier's pack. A photograph, creased and worn, showing the dead soldier with a group of men in civilian clothes, clearly taken somewhere in the United States before the war. On the back of the photograph, in English, was written a date and location: Seattle, Washington, November 1941. 1 month before Pearl Harbor. This Japanese soldier had been in the United States. He had been in an American city, photographed with people who looked American, 1 month before the war began. Hawthorne felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked at the map again, at the precise detail of the ambush positions, and a terrible thought began to form. The Japanese had not prepared these positions based on tactical guesswork or standard military doctrine. They had prepared them based on specific intelligence about Marine movements, about American strategy, about where and when forces would advance. Someone had told them. Someone had provided the Japanese with detailed information about American operations on Guadalcanal, and that someone might still be providing information. "Captain," Sullivan said quietly. He was still kneeling next to Kurt, his hand resting on the dog's head. "Captain, I need to tell you something about what happened before we found Kurt." Hawthorne turned to face his handler, and the expression on Sullivan's face made his blood run cold. "What is it, Corporal?" Sullivan swallowed hard. Right before Kurt ran off, maybe 5 seconds before, he did something strange. He turned and looked back at our column. Not at me, not at you. He looked at someone specific in the line, and his ears went back, the way they do when he identifies a threat. "Who did he look at?" Hawthorne asked, though part of him did not want to know the answer. "I couldn't tell for certain," Sullivan said. "It happened so fast, but I think he was looking at one of the replacements, one of the 3 men who joined us last week." Searched the 3 replacements. 3 men who had arrived at Guadalcanal with proper orders, proper identification, and proper credentials. 3 men who had been integrated into the company without question, because everything about them appeared legitimate. Private First Class Richard Morrison from Portland, Oregon. Private Thomas Blackwell from Sacramento, California. Private Ernest Caldwell from Tucson, Arizona. Hawthorne's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. If one of those men was not who he claimed to be, if one of them had been feeding information to the Japanese, then every operation the company had conducted over the past week was compromised. Every plan, every position, every movement had potentially been reported to the enemy. "Where are those 3 men now?" Hawthorne demanded. Sergeant Harrison stepped forward, his face grim. "Morrison and Blackwell are on the perimeter, sir. But Caldwell—" He paused. "Caldwell disappeared during the firefight. I assumed he was taking cover or repositioning, but nobody's seen him since the shooting started." The jungle suddenly felt different, more threatening, more claustrophobic. Somewhere in that green maze was potentially an enemy agent. Someone who had infiltrated their unit. Someone who had access to classified information. Someone who Kurt had identified as a threat. And that someone now knew that his cover was blown. He knew that the map had been discovered. He knew that the Marines understood they had been betrayed from within. "Lockdown," Hawthorne ordered. "Nobody moves outside the perimeter. Full alert. Harrison, take 4 men and search for Caldwell. If you find him, I want him alive, and I want answers." But even as he gave the orders, Hawthorne knew they would not find Ernest Caldwell. Or rather, they would not find the man who had been calling himself Ernest Caldwell. That person had vanished into the jungle like smoke, leaving behind only questions and a terrible certainty that the war on Guadalcanal was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Sullivan stayed with Kurt, carefully cleaning and dressing the dog's wound with supplies from his pack. The Doberman remained alert despite his injury, his eyes scanning the jungle, his ears moving constantly. Whatever Kurt had experienced in those few minutes when he had been separated from the company, whatever had led him to that Japanese soldier's body, and that map, it had changed something fundamental in the dog. He was no longer just following his training. He was thinking, processing, making decisions based on information the humans around him did not have access to. "How did you know?" Sullivan whispered to Kurt, his voice so low that no one else could hear. "How did you know about Caldwell? How did you know about the map? What did you see out there that we can't see?" Kurt looked at his handler with those brown eyes, and Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. Because in that moment, he could have sworn the dog was trying to communicate something, trying to warn him about something that had not happened yet. The search for Caldwell continued through the afternoon, but it was futile. The jungle had swallowed him completely. What the Marines did find, however, was far more disturbing than one missing soldier. They found evidence that Caldwell, or whoever he really was, had been preparing for this moment. Hidden in the vegetation near where the company had made camp the previous night, they discovered a cache of supplies, a Japanese radio, encryption codes, maps of Marine positions throughout the island, and a notebook filled with detailed observations about American tactics, equipment, and personnel. The notebook was the worst part. Written in English with occasional Japanese annotations, it contained personality profiles of officers, assessments of unit morale, predictions of future operations. It read like an intelligence report compiled by someone with intimate access to classified information. And it was dated. The most recent entry was from that morning, describing the company's planned advance to Point Tango and estimating the time they would reach the ambush zone. Lieutenant Marcus Fletcher from Boston, Massachusetts, who handled intelligence for the battalion, reviewed the notebook with shaking hands. "Sir," he said to Hawthorne, "this information could only have come from someone with access to officer briefings, someone who was present when we received our orders, someone who knew our exact route and timing." "How long has he been compromised?" Hawthorne asked. Fletcher flipped through the notebook, his face growing paler with each page. "Based on these entries, he's been reporting for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. Every operation we've conducted, every patrol we've sent out, it's all documented here. Sir, the Japanese have known our every move for almost a month." The implications were staggering. Operations that had failed, patrols that had disappeared, ambushes that seemed too well prepared to be coincidental. All of it now made horrifying sense. The enemy had not been lucky or particularly skilled. They had been informed. They had known exactly where to wait, exactly when to strike, exactly how many men to expect. "How many Marines have died because of this?" someone asked, and no one answered because no one wanted to calculate that number. As darkness fell on Guadalcanal, Hawthorne's company established a defensive perimeter in the clearing, knowing they could not advance to Point Tango, knowing they could not retreat without potentially walking into another ambush. They were trapped in a situation where every decision was compromised by the knowledge that the enemy had been inside their decision-making process. Kurt remained awake through the night, his body tense, his attention focused on the darkness beyond the perimeter. Sullivan tried to get the dog to rest, to let the wound heal, but Kurt refused. It was as if the Doberman knew something the men did not, as if he could sense a threat that remained invisible to human senses. At 02:15 hours, Kurt proved why. The dog suddenly stood, his body rigid, facing southeast. He made no sound, but Sullivan immediately recognized the posture. Enemy presence, close range, multiple targets. Hawthorne was awake instantly, moving through the perimeter to where Sullivan and Kurt were positioned. "How many?" he whispered. Sullivan placed his hand on Kurt's back, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles, interpreting signals that had become a language between them. "At least 5, he whispered back. "Maybe more. They're not moving, just watching." For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The jungle remained silent except for the constant background noise of insects and distant night birds. The Marines waited, weapons ready, every man aware that somewhere in the darkness, enemy soldiers were observing them, studying them, perhaps waiting for reinforcements before attacking. Then, Kurt did something that made Sullivan's blood freeze. The dog turned his head slowly, scanning their own perimeter, and growled. It was a low, threatening sound, directed not at the jungle beyond, but at the Marines themselves. "He's alerting on someone inside our perimeter," Sullivan said urgently. "Captain, Kurt's saying there's an enemy inside our lines." The implications were immediate and terrifying. If Caldwell had not been working alone, if there was another infiltrator among them, then they were already compromised. The defensive positions, the watch rotations, the radio frequencies, everything was potentially known to the enemy. Hawthorne made a decision that would be debated in military intelligence circles for decades. "Everyone on your feet, right now, move to the center of the perimeter." The Marines complied, confusion evident on their faces. 40 men crowding into the center of their defensive position was tactically insane. It made them vulnerable, concentrated, an easy target. But Hawthorne had realized something. If there was a second infiltrator, that person would resist this order or position themselves in a way that allowed them to signal the enemy or sabotage the group. Kurt watched the men assemble, his eyes tracking each one. When Private First Class Morrison moved into position, Kurt's posture did not change. When Private Blackwell joined the group, the dog remained alert but calm. But when Sergeant Harrison stepped forward, Kurt's growl intensified, and the dog's body language shifted into a clear threat display. Harrison froze. "Captain," he said carefully, "I don't know what's happening, but I've been with this unit for 8 months. You know me." Hawthorne did know him. William Harrison, 35 years old, married with 2 children in Atlanta. A sergeant who had earned his stripes through courage under fire, who had saved lives at Tulagi, who had been recommended for promotion twice. Harrison was one of the most trusted men in the company. "Kurt doesn't make mistakes," Sullivan said quietly. "If he's alerting on Harrison, there's a reason." Harrison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, anger, and finally something else. Something that looked almost like relief. "The dog can smell it, can't he?" Harrison said, and his voice had changed. The accent was still Georgian, but something underneath it had shifted, become harder, more precise. "Smell what?" Hawthorne demanded, his pistol now drawn and aimed at his sergeant. "The chemicals," Harrison said. The ones we use to mask our scent when we move through enemy territory. The Japanese taught us. Very effective, almost impossible for humans to detect. But a dog's nose is 40 times more sensitive than a human's. I should have thought of that. The clearing went silent. Harrison's admission hung in the air like poison gas. Several Marines raised their weapons, but Hawthorne held up his hand. "We?" he asked. "Who is we, Sergeant?" Harrison smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Do you really think this started with Pearl Harbor, Captain? Do you honestly believe the Japanese just suddenly decided to attack without years of preparation? We've been here for a long time, in your cities, your factories, your military bases, learning, observing, reporting, building networks that span from Seattle to Miami, from San Diego to Boston. When the war started, we simply activated." "You're American," Lieutenant Fletcher said, his voice strained. "I've seen your service record. You were born in Georgia. You have a family." "I was born in Georgia," Harrison confirmed. "Raised there too. But my grandfather came from Kyoto in 1889. He taught his children, and they taught theirs, that we were still Japanese first, that when the homeland called, we would answer. Not all of us, of course. Most Japanese Americans are loyal to the United States. Genuinely, completely loyal. But some of us remembered where we came from. Some of us were waiting." Corporal DeMarco spoke up, his voice shaking. "You were at Tulagi. You saved my life at Tulagi. You pulled me out of that bunker when it was collapsing." "I did," Harrison said. "I'm not a monster, DeMarco. I don't want Americans to die, but I have a duty to my true country, just as you have a duty to yours. Sometimes those duties conflict in terrible ways." Hawthorne's mind was reeling. Harrison had been with the battalion since before Guadalcanal. He had access to virtually everything. Battle plans, supply routes, troop movements, command decisions. If he had been reporting all of that to the Japanese, the damage was incalculable. "The ambushes," Hawthorne said. "The patrols that never came back. That was you?" Harrison nodded slowly. "I did what I could to minimize casualties. I'd suggest routes that I knew would encounter lighter resistance. I'd recommend pulling back when I knew an area was too heavily defended. But yes, when I couldn't prevent an operation, I made sure the Japanese were informed. I tried to save American lives where I could, but my loyalty was never in question." "Where's Caldwell?" Hawthorne demanded. "Gone," Harrison said. "He was my contact. When Kurt compromised him, when you found the map, he executed the emergency extraction protocol. By now, he's probably in a Japanese-controlled area, waiting for a submarine to take him back to Tokyo. His real name is Kenji Matsuda. He's a colonel in Japanese intelligence. He's been operating in the Pacific for 3 years." The magnitude of the infiltration was staggering. This was not just 2 men passing information. This was a coordinated intelligence network that had been in place before the war, that had been activated when hostilities began, that had cost American lives and compromised American operations throughout the Pacific. "How many of you are there?" Lieutenant Fletcher asked. Harrison looked at him for a long moment. "Enough," he said finally. "In every major unit, in most forward positions, in several command headquarters. We're not an army within an army, but we're present, and we're patient. This war will not end quickly, and when it does end, whether America wins or Japan wins, we'll still be here, still watching, still waiting." Something in his tone made Hawthorne's skin crawl. "What do you mean, still waiting? Waiting for what?" Harrison's smile grew wider, and there was something wrong with it, something that suggested he knew more than he was revealing. Do you really think this is just about the current war, Captain? Do you think nations plan only for today? Only for tomorrow? The Japanese Empire has been planning for a century of conflict. And when this war ends, whether in 5 years or 50 years, the next phase will begin. The networks we've built will not disappear. They'll evolve. They'll adapt. And when the time comes, they'll activate again. "You're talking about decades from now," Hawthorne said. "That's insane." "Is it?" Harrison challenged. "Your country is fighting Germany and Japan simultaneously. After you win, and you probably will win eventually, do you think the world will be at peace? The Soviets are your allies now, but how long will that last? China is in chaos. Europe will be devastated. The world that emerges from this war will need intelligence networks, sleeper agents, people in place for the next conflict. We're just ahead of the curve." Kurt growled again, and Sullivan realized the dog was no longer focused on Harrison. The Doberman was looking past him into the jungle, and his posture had shifted from alert to aggressive. "They're coming," Harrison said calmly. "I triggered the emergency signal when Kurt alerted on me. My unit knows I've been compromised. They're coming to either extract me or silence me, depending on what their commander decides." "How many?" Hawthorne demanded. "Enough," Harrison repeated. "And Captain, they know your exact positions, your ammunition status, your wounded, your strengths and weaknesses. I've been reporting to them every hour. This clearing is not a defensive position. It's a killing ground, and you've been sitting in it since this afternoon." The attack came at 02:45 hours, and it was unlike any engagement the Marines had experienced before. The Japanese soldiers moved through the jungle with a coordination that spoke to detailed intelligence and careful planning. They knew where every Marine was positioned. They knew the fields of fire. They knew which positions were weakest, but they did not know about Kurt. The Doberman seemed to sense each attack before it developed. He would alert Sullivan, who would signal Hawthorne, who would shift men to reinforce positions seconds before they came under fire. It was as if Kurt could read the battlefield in ways the humans could not, anticipating movements, predicting tactics. The engagement lasted 47 minutes and was brutal in its intensity. The Marines fought with the desperation of men who knew they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. But Kurt's ability to predict enemy movements gave them just enough advantage to hold their positions. When dawn broke at 06:20 hours, the jungle fell silent. The Japanese had withdrawn, leaving behind 11 dead and taking their wounded with them. The Marines had suffered 5 killed and 14 wounded, including Private Morrison, who had taken a bullet to the shoulder while defending the southern perimeter. Harrison had been killed in the first 5 minutes of the engagement, a bullet from the jungle, fired by his own people, ensuring he could not be interrogated further. His body lay where it had fallen, his eyes open, staring at the canopy above. Someone had gone through his pockets, removing anything that might provide intelligence value. Kurt was injured again. Another bullet graze, this one along his left front leg. But the dog remained alert, still scanning the jungle, still protecting his Marines. Hawthorne called for extraction, using codes that had been changed after Harrison's betrayal was discovered. The relief force arrived by 0900 hours, 2 companies of Marines supported by air reconnaissance. The evacuation was conducted quickly, efficiently, everyone aware that staying in the clearing was suicide. As they moved out, Sullivan carried Kurt, the Doberman too injured to walk the distance required. The dog kept his head up, watching the jungle pass, occasionally whining softly as if trying to communicate something Sullivan could not understand. They reached the Marine base at Henderson Field by 1400 hours. Kurt was immediately taken to the veterinary section, where a Navy corpsman named Robert Chen from San Francisco, California, treated his wounds with a gentleness that surprised the Marines watching. Chen, who was of Chinese descent, worked in silence, his hands steady, his face expressionless. "He's going to be fine," Chen said finally after cleaning and bandaging both wounds. "Dogs heal fast. Give him a week of rest, and he'll be ready for duty again." But Chen's eyes said something different. As Sullivan prepared to leave with Kurt, the corpsman touched his arm gently. "Corporal," he said quietly, "can I speak with you alone for a moment?" They stepped outside the medical tent, where the heat of the afternoon sun hit them like a physical force. Chen glanced around, ensuring they were not being overheard. "I need to tell you something about the dog," he said. "Something I noticed when I was treating him." "What is it?" Sullivan asked. "He has scars," Chen said. "Old scars, healed over, at least several weeks old. Scars that match the kinds of wounds a dog would get from fighting. Close quarters fighting, the kind where another dog or a human was trying to kill him." Sullivan felt cold despite the heat. Kurt was trained at Camp Lejeune. He came straight from there to Guadalcanal. He's never been in combat before this deployment. "Then these scars are from before his training," Chen said. "Or they're from something that happened during his training that's not in his official record. Corporal, I've been a veterinarian for 15 years before I enlisted. I know dog injuries. These scars tell me Kurt has been in multiple life-or-death situations. Someone trained him to kill, and I don't mean the standard war dog training. I mean trained him the way you'd train an attack dog for underground fighting rings." Sullivan looked at Kurt, who was resting in the shade of the medical tent, his eyes half closed but still alert. The dog who had saved his life, who had saved his entire company, who seemed to know things no dog should know. "There's something else," Chen continued. "When I was cleaning his wounds, I found something embedded in his collar. It was pushed deep into the leather, like someone had forced it in there and then sealed the hole. I removed it." Chen held out his hand, revealing a small metal object, cylindrical, about the size of a bullet casing, but made of brass with intricate engravings on its surface. "What is it?" Sullivan asked, taking the object carefully. "I don't know," Chen admitted. "But those engravings, they're not English, and they're not Japanese. I showed them to a translator, a guy from the Philippines who speaks several languages. He thinks they might be Sanskrit or something related to it. Ancient writing, religious in nature." Sullivan examined the object closely. The engravings were indeed intricate, showing symbols that looked like they belonged in a temple, not on a dog's collar. "Why would someone put this on Kurt?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Chen said. "Corporal, I'm going to tell you something that could get me in serious trouble. After I found that object, I started asking questions, quiet questions, to people who work in records and administration. Kurt's paperwork has discrepancies. His training records show he was at Camp Lejeune for 12 weeks, but the dates don't match other documentation. There's a 6-week gap where his location is listed as classified training facility, location undisclosed. 6 weeks where nobody knows where he was or what was done to him. Military dogs go through specialized training, Sullivan said, but even he could hear the doubt in his voice. Maybe it was just a security protocol. Maybe, Chen agreed. Or maybe Kurt was part of something else, something that involved whatever this object is, and whatever those scars represent. I'm just telling you to be careful, Corporal. That dog saved your life today, but there's something about him that doesn't add up. Something that suggests his presence in your unit might not be as random as it seems. Sullivan wanted to dismiss Chen's concerns as paranoia, the kind of suspicion that was running rampant through every unit after Harrison's betrayal. But he could not ignore the evidence. The scars, the hidden object, the gaps in Kurt's records, and most troubling of all, the dog's uncanny ability to sense danger and make decisions that went far beyond his training. Over the next 3 days, as Kurt recovered and the Marine Command investigated Harrison's network, more disturbing information emerged. Interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers revealed that the intelligence network on Guadalcanal was part of something much larger, an operation that stretched across the entire Pacific theater and potentially into the continental United States itself. One captured Japanese officer, a lieutenant named Hiroshi Tanaka, provided information that would remain classified until 2003. Tanaka spoke of a program called The Invisible Thread, a decades-long effort to place intelligence assets in every major American military, industrial, and political center. The program had begun in the late 1800s, as Japan modernized and recognized that future conflict with Western powers was inevitable. "We were patient," Tanaka said in his interrogation, which was recorded and later transcribed. "We sent our people to America, not as spies, but as immigrants. They had children, grandchildren. They became American in every way, except in their hearts. And when the time came, we activated them. Not all of them. Many refused. But enough. Always enough." When asked about Harrison specifically, Tanaka's face showed something like respect. "Sergeant Harrison was one of our most valuable assets. He provided information that saved hundreds of Japanese lives. But he made one mistake. He did not account for the dog. That was his failure, and it cost him everything." The interrogator pressed further. "What do you mean, he didn't account for the dog? War dogs are standard in the Marine Corps now." Tanaka smiled, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "Not all dogs are the same. Some dogs are special. Some dogs are chosen for reasons beyond their training or loyalty. Sergeant Harrison knew about the war dog program. He had prepared for that. But he did not know about this specific dog, about what made it different, about where it came from." "Where did the dog come from?" the interrogator asked. Tanaka's smile widened. "Ask the monks," he said. "Ask them what they did in those mountains, what program they were running before your government discovered it and shut it down. Ask them about the Temple of the Watchful Guardian, about the breeding program that had been operating for 500 years, about the dogs they created that could sense evil in human hearts. Then you will understand why Sergeant Harrison failed. He was detected not by your soldiers or your technology, but by something much older, much more primal." The interrogator, Captain Richard Walsh from Chicago, Illinois, assumed Tanaka was being deliberately cryptic, trying to mislead the investigation. But Walsh was thorough. He filed a report requesting information about any breeding program or religious facility that might have been connected to the War Dog Training Initiative. What came back 3 weeks later was heavily redacted, but Walsh was able to piece together fragments of a story that seemed impossible. In 1941, several months before Pearl Harbor, a team of Army intelligence officers had discovered a Tibetan Buddhist monastery operating in secret in the mountains of Northern California, near the Oregon border. The monastery had been there for decades, unknown to authorities, maintaining a breeding program for a specific bloodline of dogs claimed to have supernatural abilities. The program was shut down. The monks were interned as potential enemy agents despite being Tibetan and not Japanese, and the dogs were seized. Most were euthanized. A handful, 12 to be exact, were transferred to the War Dog Training Program, where their unusual abilities could be studied and potentially weaponized. Kurt was one of those 12 dogs. The report, what little Walsh could read through the redactions, suggested the monks had been breeding dogs for sensory abilities far beyond normal canine capabilities. The ability to detect deception, to sense hostile intent, to predict danger before it manifested physically. The monks claimed these dogs were spiritual guardians, bred from bloodlines that traced back centuries, trained through meditation and ritual to be protectors against human evil. The army had dismissed most of this as religious nonsense, but they could not dismiss the results. The dogs from the monastery performed consistently and inexplicably well in training exercises designed to test threat detection. They seemed to know when attack scenarios were simulations versus real threats. They could identify hostile individuals in crowds, even when those individuals had not yet taken any hostile action. Kurt was the most successful of the 12. His abilities were so pronounced that his training records were classified, and he was assigned to combat units under the Standard War Dog program, with his true origins buried in sealed files. Sullivan never learned any of this. The classified report would remain sealed for decades, and by the time it was partially declassified, Sullivan had been dead for 20 years, killed in a car accident in Montana in 1978. He died never knowing why Kurt had been so exceptional, never understanding that the dog who had saved his life was part of a program that defied everything the military thought it knew about canine capabilities. But Sullivan did sense that something was different about Kurt. In the weeks following the ambush, as the dog healed and returned to duty, Sullivan noticed changes in Kurt's behavior. The dog would sometimes stare at nothing, his body tense, as if seeing something invisible to human eyes. He would refuse to enter certain areas of the base, growling at specific buildings, even though there was no apparent threat. Other handlers began reporting similar experiences with their war dogs, particularly those assigned to intelligence work. Dogs behaving strangely, alerting to threats that materialized hours or even days later, refusing to trust certain personnel who would later be revealed as security risks. The Marine Corps Command took notice. A classified memo from December 1943, declassified in 2012, recommended expanding research into what it called enhanced canine threat detection capabilities. The memo specifically mentioned Kurt by name and suggested that similar dogs might provide a solution to the infiltration problem that had plagued operations throughout the Pacific. But the program never materialized in the way the memo envisioned. The war continued. The need for conventional military solutions took priority, and the handful of dogs like Kurt were gradually lost to combat, disease, or time. By the end of the war, all 12 dogs from the monastery bloodline were dead, and the monks who had created them had been scattered by internment and deportation, or so the official record stated. In 2007, a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, working on a book about war dogs in World War II, discovered something troubling while investigating the monastery story. She found evidence that suggested not all the dogs had died. At least 3 of the 12 had been transferred to a different program, one that was not part of the military War Dog Initiative. The transfer orders were signed by someone in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and the destination was listed only as Project Sentinel, location classified. Morrison tried to follow this lead, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewing veterans, searching archives. She discovered references to Project Sentinel scattered through declassified documents from the 1940s and 50s, always in peripheral mentions, never as a primary subject. The project appeared to involve using animals, specifically dogs, for intelligence gathering and threat detection in ways that conventional training could not achieve. But every attempt to find more specific information hit classified barriers. When Morrison contacted the CIA directly, She received a letter stating that if Project Sentinel had existed, which they could neither confirm nor deny, any records related to it would remain classified due to ongoing national security concerns. Ongoing national security concerns. In 2007, about a program from the 1940s involving dogs. Morrison included what she had found in her book, published in 2009, in a chapter titled Unanswered Questions. Most readers assumed it was interesting historical trivia, conspiracy theory material, the kind of thing that makes for good speculation but has no real substance. But a few readers recognized something in Morrison's research. 3 retired intelligence officers, all of whom had worked in classified programs during the Cold War, contacted her separately within 6 months of the book's publication. They would not provide details, but they all told her the same thing. She should stop investigating Project Sentinel. She should not file any more information requests. She should let this particular story remain buried. One of them, a former CIA officer named Thomas Brennan, who would only meet Morrison in a public park in Virginia, was more explicit. "Some programs never end," he told her. "They just go underground. They change names, they change oversight, they become so classified that even asking questions about them raises red flags. If Project Sentinel exists, and I'm not saying it does, it would be one of those programs. The kind where people who dig too deep have accidents." Morrison was not easily intimidated, but something in Brennan's tone made her reconsider. She did not pursue the story further. Her book sold moderately well. The chapter on Project Sentinel was discussed on a few conspiracy theory websites, and then the story faded from public attention. But in 2019, something happened that suggested Morrison had been closer to the truth than anyone realized. A military working dog named Rex, serving with a special operations unit in an undisclosed location in the Middle East, demonstrated abilities that his handlers could not explain. Rex repeatedly detected threats that were not yet manifested, identified hostile individuals before they took any action, and, on 3 separate occasions, alerted to the presence of infiltrators within Allied forces who were later confirmed to be enemy agents.